Good evening. I'm Allison Schilling, Senior Program Officer at the Concord Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's forum on Phillis Wheatley with historians Carrie Greenwich and Cornelia Dayton. Today marks the first day of Black History Month. At the Concord Museum, we firmly believe that Black history is not only for the month of February. The stories and experiences of people of color are intrinsic to Concord's and America's history. We are committed to preserving the artifacts that recount all sides of this complex historical narrative, and through our exhibitions and programming to sharing an inclusive story about our past and ongoing efforts to counter oppression. We are grateful that Black history receives an extra spotlight every February, and I do encourage you all to engage in the many wonderful programs and community events that are happening throughout the month. Dr. Carrie Greenwich has close ties to Concord as an advisor to the Robbins House, the historic site dedicated to raising awareness of Concord's African American, and anti-slavery history, and as an advisor to the Concord Museum during the redesign process of our permanent galleries. Dr. Greenwich received her doctorate in American Studies from Boston University and is currently the Director of American Studies at Tufts University and co-director of the African American Trail Project, a website that maps out more than 200 historic sites across our Commonwealth to help trace the history of Massachusetts African American residents from slavery to Black Lives Matter. Dr. Greenwich is the author of Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter. In 2020, Dr. Greenwich joined us for a forum to discuss her recently published book. I do encourage you all to watch the recording on our YouTube channel if you didn't get a chance to see it live. Cornelia Dayton is Professor of History at the University of Connecticut. She graduated from Harvard Radcliffe College, magna cum laude, in History and Government, and received her PhD in History from Princeton University. She has held numerous residential fellowships at the Huntington Library in California, the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, Harvard University, the American Antiquarian Society, and the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute. Her current research interests are in the social history of mental health in early British North America. It's a fascinating path that led Professor Dayton to new findings on poet Phillis Wheatley Peters and her husband John Peters, and the recent publication in the New England Quarterly of her essays, Lost Years Recovered, John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters in Middleton, which won the 2021 Whitehill Prize. We will learn more about that this evening. Thank you to our co-sponsors this evening, New England Quarterly, and thank you to all of our viewers and museum members for tuning in. I hope you all enjoy the program.
Thanks, Allison, and so happy to be here with you, Carrie, and Cornelia, who also goes by Nina, so I'll be calling her Nina during the evening. But Carrie, why don't you just set us off? You teach Phillis Wheatley to your students. She's part of the project that you are working on. Let's assume our viewers don't know as much as the two of you about Phillis Wheatley, and kind of give the thumbnail sketch of who she is and why she's so important, and then we're going to really focus on these lost years. But if you could set us up, that would be wonderful.
Yes, well, thank you. And thank you to the Concord Museum for holding this. And thank you to you, Nina, for your wonderful research. I'm very excited about this and about the path that you've taken with the research. So Phillis Wheatley, the person who we've come to know as Phillis Wheatley, was born around 1752. On the western coast of Africa. She arrived in Boston in 1761 as a very, very young child, so under the age of 7 or 8, as she arrived and was enslaved to the Wheatley family, a wealthy family who lived in Boston. Enslaved as a child, Phillis Wheatley began learning English and writing verses and engaging with the written word at a very young age, and eventually was taught and intellectually supported by the Wheatley family, despite being enslaved. That would be interesting to hear, Nina, as we talk about sort of your research, how it comments on kind of that moment of learning in an intellectual tradition at the same time that you're discovering her, sort of what happened to her those lost years. We know that by the late 1760s, early 1770s, she's writing poetry. And in 1773, her book of poems appears, poems on various subjects, in which she and her poetry are lauded and appreciated by George Washington, who's then the commander of the Continental Army. Phillis Wheatley, we know, dies in the early 1780s. And this is where Nina comes in with her fascinating research. We know that she married an African descended man named John Peters, and that she died in the early 1780s. And to answer your question, then I'll hand it over. The significance of Phillis Wheatley really is twofold. Henry Louis Gates, the esteemed scholar, has said, she's the foundation, the root of what we think of as African-American literature. She is the first African-American published in the Atlantic world as a woman at the time. And for many, many years, she becomes the symbol for many who engage within the Black intellectual tradition and the Black literary tradition. Phillis Wheatley is the symbol of the genesis of that tradition. She is also somebody who launches and asks us to look at how we launch and look at the creation of American letters and American literature. So Phillis Wheatley is stupendously important. She's significant for the birth of women's literature, African-American literature, kind of this African diasporic engagement with the time period in the late 18th century. And until now, much of her life, kind of these lost years, as Dr. Drayton puts it, was kind of not known by people, but she definitely is considered the mother, the founding figure, the symbol of African-American literature and letters.
Thank you, Kara. That was perfect. And I'll just add a couple of things that I only learned over the weekend, but if she travels to London, that's where the book was published. And then when she comes back, the Wheatley family emancipates her, or gives her freedom. So she's a free person when she marries John Peters, which is, I think, around 1787?
1778.
1778, yeah.
Transcript, yeah. And then maybe, Nina, before we get into the story, in earlier biographies, when she marries, how are those years covered by previous biographers?
Well, I think there are two answers. I mean, the most accurate and the place to go, that most accurate biography is by Vincent Coretta. He's actually updating it right now with the new findings, but it's a very careful research and beautifully written. And he describes their marriage as best he can, but he doesn't have a lot of evidence. He more than any other earlier biographer, followed up on John Peters as best he could, and found out quite a lot about Peters' litigation in Boston courts, especially after his wife died, after they returned to Boston. But he really didn't know. He basically said, we don't know what happened in the 3 years they left Boston. We don't know where they went. We don't know why. And we don't know Peter's backstory at that point either.
And we won't get into all of the details, but there's also a previous biographer who suggested they lived in Wilmington, which ends up, researchers go to Wilmington. There are no documents in Wilmington.
Right. And Wilmington is in the same county as Concord.
So Nina, tell us, you're not a Wheatley scholar. Tell us the research you were doing, why you were doing it, and how you discovered this new dossier.
Right. So this was one of those serendipitous, finds. I troll through lots and lots of court records because I'm trained as a legal historian, but also I just use legal papers and court records for all of my projects, particularly sort of social history projects, tracing hundreds of ordinary people. And I was reading contested will cases where usually fairly wealthy white man was died, left a will, and then some heirs challenged it, right? And I was looking for all through these for my big project on how people dealt with mental health crises and ups and downs in their lives, because often wills are contested on the basis of the testator's sanity. Did he have a sound mind when he died? And there are depositions. There are the justices of the peace would collect depositions from neighbors. So we get pretty rich testimony. And it turns out that one of these contested will cases, the issue of mental health problems was a red herring. But one of the principal litigants was a name I recognize, and that is John Peters, who I knew was Phillis Wheatley Peters's husband, and that we knew little about him. And so it was a sort of matter of, it was a discovery, but it was a matter of following the trail from that first probate contested will case to another, a second similar case, and then a whole bunch of other suits. And that began to open up the story of who John Peters was and what happened in those missing 3 years.
I'm going to walk you through that in a moment, but Carrie, do you, and you two are not an expert clearly on John Peters, but what was known before him, or again, and Phillis Wheatley wanted to be known as Phillis Peters when she marries him, but before we hear this kind of very detailed story, what had people thought before about who John Peters was? How does he go down in history before Nina's discoveries?
Well, this is interesting, and I bet Nina can tell you more. But I think this consensus in terms of African American history and literary study was that it's Phillis Wheatley, and then John Peters comes along, and there's kind of like they're married, and then they die. Like that's kind of being very facetious, but that's kind of the summary that most people had, the lay public had, and definitely many scholars had, is that she gets married and we don't really know, or given the project of African-American literature and the symbol of Phillis Wheatley, it wasn't necessarily something that many scholars had sources to or have concentrated on as deeply as the recent study.
Right. Okay. So,
and could I just add? I mean, maybe what you're getting at, Tom, is that the earliest biographer, memoirist, Margarita Odell, who lived in the 19th century and published a short supposed account of Wheatley, because Odell was somehow related to the white Wheatleys. She set up a trope that I think has been persistent of a very negative portrayal of John Peters. Yep. As aspiring, sort of greedy, not good for Phyllis, didn't take care of her, was negligent. And I would just say this new research really challenges that, as many thoughtful people have suspected that wasn't a reliable narrator. And she got lots of small things wrong. So I think she also got big things wrong. Mm-hmm. But it has been quite influential over the time. If you look up, biographical entries on it often repeats mistakes that Odell made, and in a way dismisses John Peters.
Yeah. And as we'll find in a moment, and we're not going to jump ahead, but if anything, it's very admirable what he tries to do for Phyllis in terms of creating a space for her to be the creative person that she is. So, Cornelia, I'll walk you through this, and Carrie will come back to you in a moment, yes. I promise. But essentially, we now need to introduce Nina John Wilkins, and maybe just briefly tell the story, the relationship between John Wilkins and John Peters, and then bring us to when Wilkins dies.
What we find out in particularly the depositions that arise in these probate disputes is that John Peters, the man Phillis Wheatley married, was not from the west coast of Africa, which some people thought was likely. But we don't know his parents or exact birth date. It was about 1745. But it seems that he was born as an enslaved child to an enslaved mother in this rather impoverished interior town, Middleton, which actually was carved out of another famous Essex County town, Danvers, or Salem Village, famous for the witchcraft trials. he was enslaved in this household of the man you mentioned, Tom, John Wilkins, a local lieutenant who owned a large farmstead, and his wife Naomi. And the only other genealogical thing that we discover in the cache is that John Peters, and that wasn't his name then, his name was just the first name Peter when he's baptized in the local congregational church. He had three brothers who stayed in the Middleton region, transitioning from enslavement to freedom. And they are going to be interesting figures to research. But they took a different surname than he did. They took the surname Francis. So one question about John Peters is, why did he switch away from the name he first used, to Peter Francis, he actually tried out a couple of different names before he settled on John Peters.
So when they marry, John Peters is in Boston. And I'm going to quote from your article, Nina. His wide range of skills, resourcefulness, legal literacy, mien of manly gravitas, and fierce defense of his rights are very much in evidence. These suggest some of the reasons Phillis married him. So you see him as not this kind of lout that other people write about, but as a fairly accomplished person, and again, maybe one of you, do we know how he got his freedom, John Peters, from the Wilkins family?
Well, no, we don't. In fact, it's a little more complicated in that according to a deposition, the Wilkins sold him, and so trafficked him when he was a young teen, it seems, because according to them, he became insolent and defied their control of him. And so there's this fascinating gap in his record from maybe the early 1770s, late 60s. We don't know where he was sold to. And we don't know how he exited enslavement. But we know he ended up in Boston by the year 1776 and was presenting himself as a free man, or, as his brother said, had obtained his freedom. So that's a question mark. How did that happen? But many, many people of African descent in this time period, I feel from reading other people's work, are liberating themselves. They're walking away from slavery. And Massachusetts is an interesting place because it doesn't pass legislation introducing very, very gradual emancipation. There seems to be an organic process that then gets kind of confirmed by the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution Bill of Rights and the 1783 legal cases that we often say ended slavery. But slavery is ending in the 1770s, and John Peters is part of that.
So we're going to have to gloss over some of the details, but I'll stick with you for a moment, Nina, because he certainly wins back John Wilkins's favor, Lieutenant. So Lieutenant Wilkins has two sons who die. He has a daughter, Naomi, who doesn't marry. He's got a wife, Naomi. And when in his will, tell us what John Wilkins decides to do.
Yeah, John Wilkins, and I think this sort of bequest pattern was controversial among white people. He gives to people of African descent bequests, and the most significant is to a woman who was called Dinah Cubber, who lived in his household first, it seems, as an enslaved person, and then as a free person who was a companion to Naomi Wilkins, and she receives I think 100 pounds and a feather bed, and as long as, and this is typical of white culture too, as long as she remains a faithful servant companion to the widow throughout her life. And he leaves a much smaller legacy, 10 pounds. At the time, 10 pounds meant a lot, but it wasn't, enough to live on or to buy land, to a man he calls Peter Fraser, which was John Peters' alias at the time. So it's not as if Peter Fraser or John Peters inherits a huge amount from this will, but he has reestablished his relationship with his former enslavers who sold him And they actually say to one another, this is the man who should help Naomi run the estate once John Wilkins dies. And so he comes into more of an inheritance, as we'll see, from what she invites him to do after her husband dies, and her daughter dies, and she feels disconsolate, as she says.
We just, Carrie, go back to you in a more general way. Was this do you know if this was a common thing when former enslavers die, that they, bequested land or property to individuals who they had formerly enslaved?
Yes, it happened. And depending on what era and what time period you're talking about, it happened. But we also know that a good majority of people who, Professor saying, that this process of freeing themselves and the fact that slavery as an institution was declining in Massachusetts. One of the things that goes along with that is that the majority of people who achieved their freedom in some capacity in the 1770s and 1780s were not given land or property or provided for. In fact, it was such an issue that the Black community ended up creating their own institutions to support the formerly enslaved. But it did happen. And it kind of asks us to see the complexities of enslavement, and along with that, the complexities of what freedom looks like and what was freedom felt like, and then the complexities of the relationship between enslaved people and the people who enslaved them.
So we'll go back to Nina to guide us through this story, and I'm quoting from your article. So as you mentioned, the widow, she's 65. She's legal guardian of her 36-year-old daughter and namesake, who's deemed cognitively disabled. You write, understandably overwhelmed by administering both her husband's estate and her daughter's care, she came to an agreement with John Peters to oversee the property, help manage her affairs. She gives him her power of attorney to settle debts, handle probate matters. So she, through 1779 and 1780, John Peters has the full support of the widow and her associates in town. And then describe what he does in turn, the mortgage deed that he signs related to this.
Well, as she's giving him more and more responsibility, right, to manage the core of the farm is 110 acres, and there was more land too. He's doing it from Boston, which of course is hard. It's 20 miles and no cars. And, so he hires a succession of young men, one of whom is from Reading, which is next door, west of Middleton, but part of Middlesex County. And he comes by every so often. But already the two selectmen, for instance, visit one day when Peters is there and really challenge his authority. And yet the widow has given him a power of attorney. She wants him to be doing what he's doing. But then in April of 1780, he agrees. She invites him, according to the testimony, to remove his small family from Boston and come and live in the homestead, which was a 2-story, probably lean-to, clapboard house, and really be there, right, to manage the farm. And it's pretty, she indicates that he bargained hard, and he said, I will do that only if you deed the 110 acres of the farm to me. But then the complication is, in the bargain, he then wrote her what we call a conditional deed, which means he said, I will deed this back to you if I do not fulfill a pledge to support you for the rest of your life, to the station, according to the station that you belong. So he's got himself in what I later say is a bind, because he can only remain a yeoman farmer, owner of this land, if he, in essence, pleases her and fulfills this condition.
Carrie, I'm going to go back to you. In a couple of the documents, Nina just used one word, when they invite his family. So that seems to be the indication that there are children. And then in another document that Nina discovers, the word nurse is involved, and generally a mother would only have a nurse if she, but what do we know, Carrie, or have we known previously about how many children Phillis Wheatley? It's a little vague, I think, but what's generally told about the number, whether she was a mother and whether she had children?
Well, it's generally been thought that she marries John Peters. John Peters is this ne'er-do-well. She has children. The children, if she had children, the child dies. It's unclear, depending on which sources you're talking about. And that, they're basically living impoverished lives on the outskirts of kind of society. That's definitely the notion that most historians have had, and definitely many people when they talk about Phillis Wheatley Peters as a poet.
So Nina, all of this is so fascinating. But now they're in the home, and he kind of sets out some rules, and things deteriorate when he sets out those rules. So explain what he tries to do in that household.
Well, first we'd say, this is what we call a blended household. You've got two of the mistress of the household, the white widow, and Dinah Cover, who's had a long history in the household. And also they've lived there a long time, right? They probably have their habits, but she could deliberately invites John Peters, who was a tall, good-looking Black man, according to the physical description we have of him, and the renowned poet Phillis Wheatley, and probably an infant. It's not clear, but when she used that word family, that's what it suggests, to come to Boston, and they must have brought her the wonderful books that she'd brought back from London, and a writing desk, and so what we hear from the testimony of the widow and Dinah Cover, not from the Peterses, so we don't have their voices here, unfortunately, about what happened, but is that he set up certain rules that were not appetizing, like certain friends couldn't come to the house, and he changed the furniture around, and most importantly to Dinah Cover, who has been this close companion to the widow, he tells her she cannot eat at the table with Peters and his wife and the widow. So he's treating her what they were once on a level of, of enslaved people in the household. And now he's putting himself above her as a free woman of strong personality. And he has a strong personality too.
I'm going to, again, paraphrase some points, Nina, that you make in the article that I just found quite interesting. And again, previously, he's portrayed as a bit of a lout, and he ends up in debtor's prison, and maybe he didn't support his wife. But you write, he was trying to insulate his wife from physically taxing housewifery to create space and time for her to inhabit a writer's life and be a mother. One thinks of Virginia Woolf's Room of One's Own. He's trying to create one. I mean, this is in the 18th century. He was trying to carve out for himself a status that African-descended men found nearly impossible to attain in late 18th century New England: a respected landowner, accepted neighbor, dependable town citizen. And lastly, you note Phillis Peters' presence mattered. Local people in a poor farming community were aware of her celebrity and may have been discomforted by her attainments. If Peters had moved to Middleton on his own, you suggest, things might have been different. Or if they had been in a more cosmopolitan city with other men and women of letters, the outcome might have been more sanguine. I don't know, Carrie, when you read this research about what John Peters was trying to do in this household, did you have any reactions to it?
Well, first, can I just say, when I read that part, I was like, oh, this is so fascinating. And it speaks a lot to the dynamics, racial and class dynamics that were developing in the era of the 1770s and 1780s in New England, but specifically in rural Massachusetts. So it really speaks to that. One of the things, and I think the article put it so well, is that it's at a moment when, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to be somebody in a community, right? And that was becoming even more racialized at that moment, but it was definitely a space that excluded African-descended people. And African descended people, even those who were like a Phillis Wheatley who were known. And so the fact that John Peters is claiming a stake for himself within this community, and he is in a place that is distant from the normal kind of seaports where a vast majority of enslaved and free African people lived, it really speaks to his consciousness and both of their consciousness as a couple of establishing and creating their own way. I know that sounds cheesy, but really staking their claim to a space at a time when colonists, soon to become Americans, are dealing with these issues of what does it mean to be in a town and be a person and have a place. And so I think that's very powerful in turning the tables on this narrative we've had that somehow, number one, Phillis Wheatley disappears, quote unquote, after her heyday of fame. And number two, that her husband is either a non-person or a ne'er-do-well. The fact that they as a couple and as research has shown, a child, a family, is trying to stake their claim in a place that even at the time, people of color and African descended people would not have been seen as being able to stake a claim. And I'll just point out, just historically, this is at a time when there's these warning out laws, which were legislation, policies in various New England towns, hamlets, in which formerly enslaved people, if they achieve their freedom or if they receive their, as the scholar Jared Hardesty calls it, kind of unfreedom, if they're in this spot, the white people in the town could oust them. They could warn them out. They could say that you're no longer welcome in this hamlet. And so the very fact that John Peters comes along and says, no, I'm not going to be warned out. And I'm going to stake a claim in here. And it's going to be in this rigid way. It really speaks to that notion that was happening simultaneously, which is that African descended people don't belong in certain places in New England.
I want to pursue that. I want to remind our viewers, we're happy to take your questions. We have a few that have noted that we're not talking too much about poetry. And I will just remind our audience that we've invited two historians here. Vincent Coretta's book, he is a professor of English, and there is more poetry, and I have a couple words of poetry at the very end, but we apologize that we have kind of glossed over what makes, but again, this is just so fascinating to learn about these new discoveries. And Nina, I want to actually essentially follow up on Carrie's point and quote from your article where you say, at this point, visitors to the house may have been startled at the upending of the racial hierarchies. So explain kind of what are the neighbors observing and how are they responding to it?
Well, we're not totally sure, but I just wanted to say that some of this is my interpretation, right? So other people might come to the evidence with a different interpretation. I think Carrie put it really well. I mean, one thing we do know is that the Peterses were staking their claim. I think you're absolutely right, to a significant place, partly because, I mean, I think there were other Black landowners who owned that much land, but you could still, at least from what I can tell from reading town histories, it's like count them on, both hands. And so one of the questions I think this, sorry to go off on this, Tom, but this whole new findings raises how were significant Black landowners, what reception did they receive? How were some persistent and had seemingly undisturbed presence in town? Obviously, the biggest handicap is what Carrie referred to, which is they're denied a political role and the full citizenship that a white male property owner of that kind would be. So I think that's an important handicap. But I feel that the Peterses, like Abijah and Lucy Prince in Guilford, Vermont, were harassed, as we're going to see. Their presence there is made very difficult, and so that they have to leave. So when you ask about the neighbors, Tom, I think some of them may have had severe prejudice against John Peters from the time he was an enslaved person, and now he's not enslaved. So if they're offended by that. But things really turn against the white people in the town, against the Peterses, when the widow's relationship with him ruptures. And she moves out of the house and rents a house nearby. And from then on, she makes it impossible for him to provide for her the way he had promised in that deed. And on top of that, she and her allies organize men in the community, one of whom is his brother, Snow Francis, who I think to survive has had to be deferential to the powerful white people to get, livelihood. They trespass on John Peters's fields and take away his harvest in the fall, the crucial harvest of barrels and barrels of apples and corn, loads of corn. As my friends who are experts on farms say, you had to have those to get through the winter. And then of course he sues them for trespass. He's a very savvy litigator. He used to live in Boston in a boarding house right next to the court, and it's pretty clear he's taught himself by going to court, as many people did actually, and he gets the best lawyers that he can, and he sues these trespassers and eventually wins that particular case.
Again, we're running low on time. I'm going to just quote a little bit from the article, because this relationship between John Peters and Dinah Cubbers is so fascinating. And Nina's already mentioned it, that they had been living in the home, as younger people. It's not a question of whether, not sure if she was also enslaved or just a servant. Then he comes back as head of the household. I'll just read a couple of quotes. Naomi reports that he demanded that she caution Cubber not to continue to be, quote unquote, saucy with him and his wife. And then Cubber alleges that Peters privately taken to telling her that she was his servant, and that if she did not behave as she wished, he would send me where there is no winter. This was a very serious threat, meaning he was considering selling her into slavery in the West Indies or South Carolina. But maybe, Carrie, you can just, again, it's somewhat conjecture. I mean, that's what's interesting about this article. There are the depositions, and then, but do we have other instances of things like this, Carrie, where you have a male, formerly enslaved person becoming the head of the household with others in that household? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this was common. We're talking about as slavery is being undermined, is declining, and as people of African descent are seizing and making their own way, and as the professor said, like leaving and just picking up and leaving and going places and forging their own way. As that is happening, you also have slaveholders who are responding to the end of slavery and enslavement and selling their enslaved people to markets to make a profit, right? So if slavery is ending, say in New Hampshire or Massachusetts, and you own enslaved people, selling them to the West Indies or to South Carolina. A case of that was the Paul family. Thomas Paul became a minister, a founding minister of the African Baptist Church on Beacon Hill, and his family was from New Hampshire, and he had relatives who were sold, who were free. They were in New Hampshire, slavery starts to decline, who were then sold into South Carolina, right? And so then he spends years trying to get them back. So to have somebody make that threat, right? I'm going to send you to a place where there is no winter. I mean, that would have been, we don't have anyone saying he's saying that in specifically to sell her into enslavement, but that would have been the threat, and very known as a threat at that time.
And fast forward to 1782, and this is maybe the most shocking part of the story, Nina. Violent tensions between John Peters and Dinah Cubber erupt again, and he accuses her, quote, of assaulting John's infant child and, quote, attempting to destroy the life of said child. He brings her to court, but then in the end, the case is dismissed, or he doesn't fully pursue it. But again, we can kind of imagine what's being suggested here, but maybe you can talk about your conclusions in the article about this piece.
Well, it is a shocking and disturbing fragment that we have, it's something like 26 words, and we have no other. It was because he didn't pursue charges. It didn't proceed to trial, but it seems to be an attempted murder accusation, and it is the only firm evidence that we have in the written record that Phillis Peters and John Peters had a child. There are inferences in these new findings that in the first summer they spent in Middleton because she had a nurse for a month, that either she'd had a miscarriage or stillborn child, or a child that lived, and this might be that child 2 years later who was allegedly attacked. So for the importance of it for the biography and the life of Phillis Wheatley, it's an important and extremely jarring piece of evidence. But we don't really know what to do with it, except that we don't know where the tensions between Dinah Cover and John Peters came from, and we just know that they're very much present there in Middleton. But we might say that the opinion of a Black woman was important in the community, both among whites and Black people who lived in Middleton and nearby, because she was as outspoken, evidently, as the white widow was about her dislike of Peters and her criticism, and it seems to have had an effect. So I think this speaks to, as Carrie put it, the complexities of a landscape that had been, where enslavement had, all whites had really almost been complicit in slavery, and because slavery is ending, I think of the word that we use in our culture today, backlash. To what extent is there, and how can we sort of get at it as researchers, white backlash to people of African descent liberating themselves, asserting themselves, as John Peters did, or how much of it was something deeply personal between these two people. But there are other tensions too that Peters has in Middleton. And, I don't know, maybe it's the novelist territory.
Yeah. So let's, one thing that's interesting is that Phillis Wheatley isn't actually mentioned in this story. So we are, and there are folks commenting that we're ending up talking about more about John Peters, but maybe Carrie, you can explain why, that when we go look for the historical record of someone like Phillis Peters, it's through her husband that we have to learn about, again, where she was living, whether she had children. Maybe just explain a little bit more about what we're learning about Phillis Wheatley through this story.
Yeah, I think that we need to understand, and there's historians who pointed this out. I'm thinking of like a Martha Jones. I'm thinking of other people who have looked at Black women and women's history, is that you're dealing with the sources that were created at the time period. And so if you have a woman of African descent, formerly enslaved, who is then achieves her freedom and then marries, the record on her as an autonomous human being, her being listed in records at all, are pretty slim. Now, that doesn't mean that you as a historian can't read and analyze and look at the sources and find a trail of that person. And part of the trail that you find is somebody, as this article shows, you're finding it through these other avenues. And even if you can't see specifically Phillis herself in the way that we would want to in 2022, you're going to have these traces of her through the people that she interacted with, because the archive is not going to, is based on the people who were keeping records at the time. And I think of it, I kind of look at it as people who research any woman who was a novelist or a writer. Oftentimes you get to looking at their life through the people who surrounded them, right? So Emily Dickinson is a good example, right? Emily Dickinson is not known in her lifetime, and we know a lot about her from what appears in her poetry, but also then she's related to this family. So you research the family, and scholars who study Dickinson, that's how they get at kind of who Emily Dickinson was. So this is a phenomenal work and has to be done in order to get at Phillis Wheatley, the person, because you're dealing with the constraints of the archive that you have, and the archive not allowing or counting women and enslaved people and Native American people, but nonetheless, they were people who existed. And so part of the job of a historian is peeling back the layers of the sources that you have.
And Carrie, sticking with you for a minute, if in addition to reading these books, and I'd also recommend Skip Gates's book, The Trials of Phillis Wheatley, and this new lovely book of poetry by Honoré Fanon Jeffers, The Age of Phillis, for those who wish to learn more. But Carrie, in terms of the work that you're doing with the African American Trail Project, are there sites in Boston that people can go to learn more about Phillis Wheatley?
Yes, and I would first say that I have a good partner in this, Dr. Kendra Field, who is a professor of history, and she engages a lot with the history of Black and Native people, and we run it together. But the Trail Project, I would suggest, for those in Concord, going to the Robbins House, and that kind of gives you an idea of the footsteps of enslaved people and free people and their families and their communities within where you live. Going into Boston, seeing Long Wharf, which still exists, and that is an approximation. It's not the exact place from which Phillis Wheatley's The Boat came in, the Phillis that brought the young person we know as Phillis Wheatley from the Atlantic slave trade into Boston. Going through downtown Boston and seeing the footsteps of people who were free in Boston at the time. There's a structure or a plaque that was dedicated a few years ago, 10, 15 years ago, to the first Black homeowner in the city of Boston that is on the Greenway. And so you can go to all of these sites and grasp at, see the traces that enslaved people, their communities, free people, their communities, contemporary people in their communities left on the landscape. And part of that is doing what this article does, which is going and meticulously looking at the records that you can find, and then using your gift of historical analysis to figure out like who was in a space at a time. But definitely, I would say if you're in Concord, the Robbins House, the Concord Museum. If you're in Boston, I would say the Long Wharf, and sort of just looking at that landscape of the harbor side in Boston and what that might have looked like to a child who's coming in a ship in the 1750s and is enslaved by the Wheatley family.
Allison, if you could put the slide up. I wanted Cornelia just to talk briefly about, again, this research, and just this gives a little taste of the types of documents or things that you found. Maybe, Nina, you can just tell us what is on this slide.
Just briefly, the longer document is Dinah Cubber's deposition. Now, she didn't write this herself. Justice of the Peace wrote it, but you see that she marked her name X, and sometimes her name is spelled Dinah Cubber. Sometimes it's with two B's. So this is the sort of deposition that we have in these new papers. And I just wanted to point out John Peters' signature, because one interesting biographical issue is his literacy compared to his wife's literacy. Presumably, he is more self-taught. And so I have yet to find a whole document he's written. We have documents he signed. This is a petition for a retail license in Boston. But I think further exploration may come. And he owned 13 books and a Bible when he died in 1801. So, I think that means he was a reader, and he cared about books. And then lastly, the longer horizontal document in the middle is signed by the president of the council, Thomas Durfee, or it's actually addressed to Durfee, I think. And it is the one piece of evidence we have describing John Peters. He wears a black wig. He is tall, well-limbed, lusty, by which they meant healthy, likely black fellow, and lately married the famous poetess not named, notice. And this is another intriguing part of his biography, and that is that they are suspecting him of possible aiding the British. And so again, we knew he didn't serve as a soldier in the Revolutionary War. So one wonders, what was his revolution like, right? And actually, the thing we do know is he was an itinerant trader with a white male partner in Worcester and Hampshire County. But this suggests, my own interpretation is that he was wrongly accused by someone, because this longer document asked him to be arrested or stopped and questioned, and if whoever did that thought him suspicious, to be brought in arms to Boston, and that didn't happen.
Thanks, Alison. I think we can take the slide away. And so, Carrie, again, what do we know about the end of Phillis Wheatley's life?
Phillis Wheatley's life.
At the very end, yeah.
The traditional notion was that she died impoverished, and the unspoken notion before this article has come out in the research is that somehow the implication is, it's John Peters's ways that end up leading her to die impoverished. And at some point there was an argument even in the 90s that she died without ever being known, and that people didn't know who she was. Of course, we know that's not exactly true, but that was the traditional story of her demise.
Nina, you mentioned in your article that he was in debtor's jail, John Peters, when she died, but he was, quote, granted liberty of the yard to be in attendance at her funeral.
Well, that's my assumption, Tom. I mean, I'm just talking to people who know about how jails were run. The jail is just a few blocks from where she was living, or their lodgings were. And I think he would be granted what they call liberty of the yard and for the funeral procession. So it's a guess. It's a hunch.
Okay. And then, Nina, tell us about this very fascinating ad that he places in a newspaper, and the intrigue that suggests.
Well, one big question that biographers have had about Wheatley is, where is her second manuscript, handwritten volume of poetry? Because we know that during their marriage and twice they advertised in newspapers to try to get a subscription, which is how to publish the book, which is how a lot of books got published. You had to sort of raise small amounts of money from interested readers to fund, to persuade a printer to publish the book. And so Peters, after her death, there is some correspondence at the American Antiquarian Society that suggests a publisher, someone in a white man in Boston, was told by Peters, it's inferred that he had found the manuscript. He'd actually lost it when Phillis Wheatley died. He advertised for someone to please return it to him. And we've always wondered, did someone return it? But now we think probably someone did, but it never got published. And so the people interested in Phillis Wheatley's poetry and writing have been aching to have the proverbial find of this manuscript. And this is one reason I think researching John Peters is important, because it could lead us, since their lives were imbricated in those final years, to the dispersal of her books, which we know a little more about, the books she brought back from London, and this crucial manuscript. And I would say her letter. She was quite a correspondent before 1770, 1780, and we have none of her letters. So where are they? Was it simply people didn't save them because she signed Phillis Peters and they didn't know the significance of that in the connection to African American literature? So there are a lot of unanswered questions.
Carrie, in terms of her literary legacy, and I know we're speaking to two historians here, but there was a bit of a backlash against some of her poems. And then, as often happens, there's the backlash, and then people are somewhat rehabilitated. But maybe just describe what that backlash is about.
Yeah, Phillis Wheatley has traditionally been revered by Black communities and by Black women. So you would have Phillis Wheatley clubs, for instance, that arose in the late 19th century, women's clubs that were involved in philanthropic activity within Black communities that were named after Phillis Wheatley. So she was beloved by many members, Black women in particular. When we start to get into the 20th century and the birth of and the expansion of literature, away from kind of the romanticism that she is affiliated with, then her poetry itself came out of favor, and particularly in the 1960s and 1970s with the rise of the Black arts movement, which was linked to revolutionary struggle and the struggles of the affirmation of Blackness and Pan-Africanism and the politics of it. Many Black male writers kind of dismissed her as being imitative, right? That she was somebody who was not creating her own verse, that she was merely mimicking and parroting white, quote unquote, white literary traditions from England. And so that was the backlash in the 60s and 70s. And then during the 70s and 80s, we get a rise of Black women, historians, feminist scholars, Black feminist scholars who really resurrect her along with other writers like Zora Neale Hurston. I really start to argue that she, and I'm thinking of a great book by Mia Bay, the famous scholar, all of these scholars who argued that we need to take Black women's intellectual production seriously, right? And that we need to take it seriously that she is doing something with her writing, just as we would assume that like an Emily Dickinson is doing something with her writing, and that it's not imitative. It's her life and her literature deserve to be studied as you would study any intellectual tradition. So it's definitely so glad to see it now come back to really taking her as an intellectual, right? As somebody who is engaging with the world and is composing the world and has a whole life, right? That isn't just reduced to what we've previously known about her.
And both Skip Gates, I mean, it's at the center of his essay, this moment where there were people famous, John Hancock, James Bowdoin, who had to attest that she actually wrote these poems.
Yes.
Carrie, maybe just talk a little bit, and it's a big part of Vincent Coretta's book, and he has the photos of the individual men who were there. But just set that scene a little bit for us, Carrie, and then we'll close out, Nina, with some final words for you.
Yeah, well, the notion that many of these patricians of Boston society and Massachusetts had about authenticity and authorship was this idea that as an African descended person and as a woman, it was an impossibility, as Henry Louis Gates says in the book, for her to produce this literature, and that there was something blasphemous, if not slanderous, of her claiming to have produced this. And so her having to sit before this group of white judges, town fathers, city patricians to prove, quote unquote, that she had engaged in this intellectual endeavor. And that goes into kind of the period of time in which she's writing, which is that this growing belief in the 1760s, 70s, 70s of like a racial science, right? It's just emerging, the fact that, people of African descent cannot possibly engage in the type of sophisticated Republican little r discourse that Europeans and white Americans can engage in.
Nina, you want to just close us out with what you hope your scholarship provides, and really the future of scholarship, is historical scholarship, not literary. Again, we have historians here, but the avenues that you either will pursue or that you hope others will pursue. What still needs to be learned here?
Well, we got in, to our conversation, the many unanswered questions about John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters and how those may be intertwined. He lives, of course, another 16 years, and I think that's a fascinating life. But he's both an example of the obstacles that people, African descended people and indigenous people faced in this time of ferment, right? Constitution framing, the first emancipation, as people put it, in New England. And I'm really hoping. I mean, I know that there are lots of people researching right now Black lives and using court records and trying to follow up on details. And Tara Bynum raised a really interesting point, I think, that should provoke us, which is all those collections of prominent white families that are housed in our historical societies. Have we really read through those looking for Black lives and for John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters? I mean, when it's not obvious, perhaps, that that's who's being referred to. I mean, maybe we haven't. Maybe there are threads right in, I think there are in the court records and booksellers' papers, lawyers' papers, but also just in the huge amount of writing we have by white family members corresponding with one another. And she suggests we need to look again carefully.
Yep.
So there have been a few comments again that we didn't talk as much about poetry, but I did. Her very last poem was called Liberty and Peace. I thought I would close with, it's 1784. She signed it Phillis Peters, again, not Phillis Wheatley, but Phillis Peters. The first two lines, lo, freedom, and remember 1784 or revolution. I mean, we didn't really talk about the historical backdrop on which all of this is happening, but I'll close with Phillis Peters' words. Lo, freedom comes, the prescient muse foretold, all eyes the accomplished prophecy behold. And then the last lines of the poem, auspicious heaven shall fill with favoring gales, where'er Columbia spreads her swelling sails, to every realm shall peace her charms display, and heavenly freedom spread her golden ray. And Carrie Greenidge and Nina Dayton, we thank you for spreading some light on the life of Phillis Wheatley and John Peters. There's so much more to be discovered. We thank all of you, viewers, for joining us this evening. Please join us next week. I'll be chatting with Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy on his new book of essays. So we thank you for joining us. And again, Nina and Carrie, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you for the research. It's wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Bye-bye.